thank you everybody for this morning. The wonderful talks. I think you'll all agree. And so what I would hope to do for the next 45 minutes or so is take a bit of time to reflect on some of the talks. We got some questions that have come in, but really to facilitate a conversation between you all, primarily, that we're kind of guests at the conversation, that and to kind of spark that conversation with questions from the audience. And maybe what I'd like to start off with is, I was struck by the generational perspectives, and I say that as someone that's probably closer to your age, Chad and Anil, than your age. And what struck me was the perspectives that we're grounded in are probably originated from our formative years and the state of technology in our formative years, the state of society and culture in our formative years. So let's say 80s to 90s, from, let's say, childhood to teens to early 20s, when really our ideas and opinions of the world are shaped. And then the tools are at our disposal that are state-of-the-art, and depending on how accessible they are to us. One of the things that I regularly reflect on is how, if I was to start again today, I don't even know where I would start. There's just so much stuff. Even if it was just web, right? There's just so much stuff. And so I was struck by the energy and enthusiasm that's probably fueled by the tools at your disposal that we didn't have. But I was also really struck by the reflective and contemplative perspectives that you only really get when you've lived long enough to have seen various cycles, and how sometimes cycles, they don't necessarily repeat, but they echo, or they rhyme, I think a poet once said. And so one of the things I'd be interested in is seeing how would you each, if you were in the position of myself or Chad or Anil, and you were, let's say, had 20 more years on you, knowing what you know of what came before before your formative years, how would you best help us grapple with all the so much stuff that exists, and how we could, come at it with probably with the same sense of enthusiasm and creativity that I certainly had when I was younger. That energy drains in different places. So I would love to hear from, and feel free to jump in where it makes sense. Does any of that resonate, or am I barking up the wrong tree here?
Are you asking them
generally
how they might parse the complexity of what exists today? Or
That's a very elegant way of phrasing my last 5 minutes. Yes.
Thank you.
I can maybe start on my perspective here. I'm actually reading a book right now. It's called Same as Ever. I forget the author, his name, very famous guy. But the entire theme of the book is just that, the fact that some things just stay the same. And like you said, like, cycles might not repeat themselves, but the fact that they echo is that there is a few fundamentals that continue to repeat no matter what, right? Like, even just our talks today, like after I gave mine, I was listening to everybody else's, and there's the same themes are like, yes, like that's, yes, 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 even though they're entirely different, like, experiences. At the end of the day, people want to solve problems. People want to build things that help each other. People want to, like, there's fundamental things about what makes us human that we keep coming back to. And it's viewing, at least for me right now, not having actually the 20 years to reflect back on, is I have a hunch, I don't know, but I have a hunch that it'll be the same problems that we continue to be working on and solving for at the most sort of first principle level. And technology, design, product, the new technologies that come out, they're all just an evolution of the tool set that we can use to approach that. And so in my head, what I naturally end up doing is separating those two, is like AI as a tool, not the thing. the thing is all the problems that we want to solve to make our lives better, and we're constantly going to be doing this. It's in my head, maybe because we've heard from folks growing up that have similar perspectives, like, or at least I've heard from folks that have similar perspectives that Shah and Anil of like, you know, this problem still exists. Like, we've been trying to solve it. Like, why hasn't it gotten better? Like, part of me thinks that we're always going to have some version of that problem, because as you try to solve the one thing, there's going to be something else that crops up that we have to solve for. And it's always going to be this thread of the human condition. And so how do we use the tool sets that we're given within the context of that space to at least try to make an improvement in that, no matter what sort of time frame we're in? I don't know if that makes sense. It's very nebulous. But just separating the two as like the problem statements that continue to be the same, I think, generation over generation, to the tool sets that will change generation over generation.
I think, is my mic working? Yes. Maybe it's because we're engineers and we're technologists that, you know, we're so used to thinking about problems in this static sense where they exist or they don't exist. But people who come from a background of social science have a much stronger grasp of, I mean, they call these sorts of problems wicked problems, right? Because it's multifaceted. There are multiple stakeholders involved. And when you try to solve it from one lens, you always somehow end up making it slightly worse for someone else. And this kind of goes in circles. And you see this a lot in policy as well. Like, how do you come up with the policy that's like the global descent optimum for something? It's really hard to do because it's like not convex. It's sort of like all these different spaces in the problem which help some people and doesn't help other people. So there's this really great paper on how you go about solving these sorts of problems. And the conclusion was essentially you iterate in very much the same way that you say. And if you guys are familiar with machine learning, like gradient descent, the way you solve it is you iterate. You make really small steps in a direction that makes sense. And the plane itself, like the problem space, kind of evolves with culture, with what we value. And so this landscape is changing, and you're just trying to make steps in the right way. And I think as a young person dealing with the complexity, you just learn as much as you can and take in as much information as you can. And you try to make decisions that feel right to you and align you with what you think is the way that we should be going. And that's all you really can do.
I think I would echo what you said, where it's really about the problem, not so much about the tool. So even though there may be many more tools available today than there might have been 20 years ago, you know, I feel like very early on when I was in my computer science degree, I was sort of grappling with that problem of, do I want to go into web? Do I want to go into robotics? Do I want to go into electrical engineering? What kind of technology do I want to be working with? And I feel like these days I've discovered that rather than being tied to a specific technology and saying, oh, I'm a JavaScript developer, or, you know, I'm doing AI or whatever, you know, particular bucket you might want to put yourself in, it's more about what problem do I want to solve, and then what's the tool for that problem. And really the skill, I think, that requires development in a lot of people is learning how to pick the tool for the problem, not learning the tool. Because once you've picked the tool, the rest is all just, you know, solving the problem, which is really what we're here to do. No one really sets out and says, oh, I want to write JavaScript for the rest of my life, you know, especially JavaScript developers. You know, it's usually about the problem. It's about, oh, I want to design the next, you know, wonderful federated social network, or you know, choose your problem. The tool is just the detail.
I guess I have the inverse question, which is, when you talk to like somebody who's old like me, what are the things we're getting wrong where you're like, all right, the boomers just don't get it? Like, what's the stuff that are the preconceptions, assumptions, or the like bad advice where you just sort of cross it off the list? I feel like you must get that.
I mean, I think it's quite hard to generalize because not everyone gives the same advice. Like you ask 10 different people who you consider grown up or adults, and you realize that like everyone has their own perspectives, and you get 10 different pieces of advice, and really what you can do is rely on what your gut feel is. And this is because we forget this, but you know, just because people are older than us, they're still on their first life. they're still figuring it out, right? Like, it's not like anyone has more lives than anyone else. We're all just figuring it out. And I realized this when I became 21. I was like, when I was 21, I'm going to feel like an adult. I'm going to know everything. I'm going to know exactly what I want to do. And then at 21, I was like, yeah, I feel 14. Like, nothing changed. And I feel like nothing changes.
Yeah.
So,
Still,
yeah.
yeah, it's going to keep.
I have some bad news for you, man.
On the topic of tools versus outcomes, or however you want to say it, that we're all sort of circling around, that was one thing I was thinking about when Molly was speaking earlier, that this rhymed for sure, your talk rhymed, and it rhymed with the open source world in the 90s. I was one of those open source zealots. We were really trying to kill Microsoft. We wanted to win, so it was like Linux first. Next year is the year of Linux on the desktop, still.
2025, let's go.
Exactly. And we were like seriously ideologically driven. We were making business decisions based on stupid things that were not business related. We were talking about open source first, even though the applications were horrible, and they still are. Open source applications tend to be. The same is happening with crypto, and the same is happening with AI. So these are all the same thing. I think crypto is worse because you also have just like massive liquidity early. You don't have to wait for an IPO. You trick people into speculating, and it's all unregulated. But it's the same exact thing where you're going and saying, I'm going to make a crypto thing, as opposed to I'm going to go make a thing and solve the problem. So blockchains aren't bad. And also stuff like MetaMask and the way identity works in crypto is amazing. Like, we should take that stuff and apply it to the web as a whole, as opposed to try and make crypto be the web. The whole Web3 thing. I even have this, like, I have to use the shortcut because when I'm talking to people, it's a shortcut now. I always even hated blog for, that word, but it's nonsense, as you said. But it's nonsense both because it doesn't mean anything and because it means too much, and it puts these technology choices first. So I wouldn't start an investment firm and say, I'm going to only invest in people who are deploying on Postgres. That's stupid. I should also not do the same thing for blockchains or any other sort of technology, or this is an AI startup. That's nonsense. AI is not a thing that you build. It's a tool that you use to solve problems.
Yeah,
well,
100%.
Well, one of the things that occurred to me as you were saying that was I remember in the early days of Linux how there was a cultural convention that manifested in the practical reality of how people even compiled programs, right, to just get something running on their Linux on the desktop that they had, and to be comparable from a problem-solving perspective to what would be on Windows, which had a very easy point-and-click install wizard, boom, 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 done. Well, I have to know how to compile C in order to do something comparatively. And, so part of the emergence of these countercultural technical movements counterintuitively tends to be, let's create stuff that's so complex that it creates this artificial barrier that excludes people who could actually help improve things. And I don't know if I haven't really paid enough attention to what's happening in AI to say certainly that's a thing that exists, but I do feel there was elements of that with Web3, even down to terminology about how people would, broadcast their message to the world. There was conventions around language and messaging that if you didn't get the acronyms, then you weren't really part of it. And if you're not part of it, then, get lost. And I think that's a pity, that it prevents adoption, it prevents traction, it prevents growth. Have you guys seen any evidence of that in the work that you're doing?
I mean, I think that's not just tech, even finance, right? You have all these terms and all this terminology and jargon related to how you manage your money that bankers will create almost to make it something that everyone can't access and everyone can't feel super included in how they manage their money. This is a combination of the two questions. I was an econ major, I minored in CS, and I am a huge fan of the social sciences meeting tech space, mainly because I think different perspectives bring different applications to these tools that aren't just for the tech industry. Like you said, there isn't maybe a tech industry, it's everyone solving with tech. And even in that, every time we talk about modeling behavior, economics is basically trying to model behavior that people have naturally, right? We're not trying to create new behavior as much as like finance is, but it'd be like looking out there, seeing what's happening, identifying patterns, and creating ways to model to see how a policy or something might have impact. And being able to take that with tech and the intervention now being tech instead of policy, you're doing the same thing over again, is modeling how that actually impacts somebody. And that piece was really interesting to me, to be able to take some of the stuff literally in my econ class at like 9 a.m. and then going to my CS class at like 11 and seeing like stuff that's parallel that you can actually solve with. And so to Sean's point, like I think that amalgamation of like finding a way to have tech tools in everyone's hands is so important. The same way I think it's finding ways to have education and like financial freedom for everybody without having to think about what like a CDO is, and like what does that mean, and having to talk to a financial advisor to manage your own money. So I think that's the same for both.
That's one of the benefits of information being more widely available and accessible, is people can make those leaps into kind of adjacent or even like spheres that are very different from where they are, to spot those patterns and opportunities. We have some questions from the audience. Thanks for submitting, guys. This is I think it's for everybody, so feel free to jump in. It's from Toby. How can we scale and democratize technology that empowers people so that having agency over your digital life doesn't remain a privilege?
Seems thematic to what we were just talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think about this a lot when it comes to web software, because I spend a lot of time thinking about how can, everyone feels like they hate the web right now because they're using, one of 4 platforms, and it feels like they have no opportunity to move or to, express themselves in the way that they want, or, everyone has their own complaints, but it feels like nobody likes it. So how can we develop alternative systems that allow people to be themselves on the web, to have their own corner, their own little space that they carve out for themselves on the web, to do whatever it is that they love to do. For some people it's build a beautiful website, some people love to write, blog posts, whatever it is that you want to do. But then you run into the challenge that it's like, okay, so you have to go buy the domain name, and then you have to go find hosting, and you have to figure out how to do DNS, which even tech people hate. And, it's like this whole challenge. And I think that's where we need to go in the very near future, is making it really easy for your average person who just wants to be able to, sign up for Facebook. It should be just as easy as that, to go and create their own space where they have total control, where they own the content that they've created and can decide how they want to license it, how they want to distribute it, who they want to distribute it to, how those people interact with it. Because right now it's really challenging. There are a couple of solutions. There's blog software that you can go and install, and some of it's pre-hosted. But then you sort of get into this question of, now you have to pay for it, and not everyone can afford it. And I think there needs to be this sort of universal access to just a base level of sort of presence online that everyone is able to have access to if they want it. And, if you don't want it, that's fine too, but not requiring everyone to be able to go, spin up a virtual server and install Nginx and, write some HTML. And, once you start saying, okay, open a terminal, like you've gone too far. So, I think that's where there's so much opportunity right now in the tech world, is finding that that ease for people who just want to do their own thing. They don't want to be constrained to 280 characters or more if you pay for it. They want to have their own space. They want to build their own things. They want to have, I think of the early days where you could have, marquee text and glitter GIFs, and MySpace was crazy, and you'd open it up and audio would start playing. It was chaos, but it was yours. And I think there's so much space for something like that today.
It wasn't actually yours, though. I agree with everything.
No, that's
you said.
very true.
I think there's a point that I would add exactly to what, on the list, is they should also own their own data, and they should own their identity, and it should all be portable. And there is, by the way, an ideological technical movement forming around this that people are calling local first software, or it used to be offline first or whatever, client server, maybe it used to be called. I was at this conference 3 weeks ago or so in Berlin about this, and I heard a really great talk that answers this question by Maggie Appleton.
I love her.
Yeah, she has a
So I was going to say Google her, but that seems like the wrong thing to say right
I
now.
think it's probably just maggieappleton.com. Maybe we just skip the search.
But find Maggie Appleton, and here's the term that she uses is barefoot programmers. This is what she was talking about. And the whole idea is having, building environments that are composable and malleable enough that everyone can be a developer. And it's not about no-code development and that sort of thing, but it's more about I have this thing that I run for just my family, or I have this other thing that I run just for this community or my church or whatever it is, and it's completely configurable, and I can own the data. It's a vision with partial implementations that exist. I think she paints a really great picture, so without actually recounting her entire talk, I would say go find it.
I would also add one more thing just in terms of creating your own space on the web is I think we need to be very flexible on what that means for different people. Because there are some people, I love spending hours tinkering with my website and creating my own software, and it's buggy, but I love it and it's mine. And then there are people who's I just want to be able to write and click a button and it goes out. And so, for some people, having their own space on the web, for example, is going to mean buying a domain and pointing it to their Twitter account. Or it's going to mean, pointing it to some other service that maybe is very much not their own, but, that's their platform for now. But that is still such a good step beyond, having twitter.com/username and then it can go away at any time, or you decide that Twitter is a garbage fire and so you want to move somewhere else and you have to tell everyone where you went. You've still got that domain, you've got that identity online. You can keep that identity even if everything underneath it changes. That's one thing I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit, not that I haven't been for the past couple of minutes, but that's one thing I love about using your own email or using your own domain as an email alias is that I like Gmail. Gmail works great for me. I've been using it for years. But because I have an @mollywhite.net address, if Gmail ever goes up in flames, that's fine. All the people I email with can find me wherever I end up because it's still going to be that domain name and it's still going to be me online. It's not going to be me on a platform somewhere. So that's one thing I think is so important about sort of carving out your space is having an identity that you control, that you can take with you. And even if it is temporarily or permanently pointing at some other service, it's still more yours.
Even then, though, there is a problem with it in that the domain name still isn't truly yours.
This is
We're
true.
essentially leasing them from companies that will probably be around for decades to come.
That's true. There is the issue with domains, but I feel like they are a lot more yours than
They are, yeah.
than something
You're going to say something?
Attacking a couple things. First, to get in a plug, we have a workshop later on building your own personal website, so stop feeling bad about it. We'll help you do it.
I was actually just teeing him up.
Yeah, that's great. A couple things I'd call out. I think the first is we have a understandable but false dichotomy between enabling the complexity, lots of platforms, lots of algorithms, lots of services, and usability. So simple that insert family member here can sign up for an app and use it. And the truth is we've been able to reconcile the tension between those things many times. Right, so all of you have heard a podcast end with subscribe to us wherever you listen to podcasts. It is a radical statement, right? It is an open architecture that hundreds of millions of people can use. Email, right? The seamlessly changing email providers happens every day. You have emailed people who switched email providers since the last time that you sent them a message and you didn't know it changed, right? Those are things that are extraordinary, and if they didn't occur all day every day, we would think they couldn't be done. So it's just really, really important to understand that it is possible to build those architectures if we're diligent about it, hold the line, and also we have to have a collective consensual hallucination that it can be possible, right? That's what makes it possible to do it. The other thing, and we were talking about this at lunch, but this is a conversation I have a lot. The personal human web is still here and has always been here and is bigger than it has ever been. Right? We choose where we put our attention, but just because you're scrolling on your For You page on TikTok doesn't mean that the web isn't still the web, right? There are more people that are building these sites and sharing their content. Now, I'm not faulting anybody for that. Like, we are all subject to the, you know, the button that pushes the dopamine receptors in our brains, right? So can it be easier? And I mean, I'm fully just, you know, sort of shilling today, but the work I've been doing with the glitch community that I lead for the last 7 years is really about, I always say it's a yes code platform, not a no code platform. But like, coding is great. If the rest is easy and you don't have to fight with it, it's actually kind of joyous, and you can build off other people's work and remix it and whatever. And literally the latest thing that we did was, we don't care if you built it on Glitch, share whatever it is. Like, we think there's not enough places to discover human web, right? Like, things that are not sort of corporate sites. And there's so much pent up demand. People are very excited about it. But like, even just in the platform that I help run, it's millions of people. And they are, like, there's kids, yeah, there's developers, but there's like regular people that are like, because I'm a fan of BTS, I wanted to make a fan site for them, and I knew I couldn't do it on, you know, Twitter or whatever, because I couldn't do it the way I want, because they won't let me design it my way. And somebody told me I could make a website. That's the same impulse that it was with MySpace a generation ago, and GeoCities and LiveJournal a generation before that, right? Like, people have been doing this. I think people forget, like, MySpace, like, yes, you don't own it, but one of the things that's interesting about it is, in that era, and for people who weren't around then, until about 2007, from about 2004 to 2007, the most popular social platform was MySpace. It let you edit the CSS, it let you edit the JavaScript. But what was extraordinary about it was tens of millions of people built web pages. It was a normal, ordinary thing that people did, right? It's not this priesthood that is so exclusive that people can't do it. And they did it in their free time, voluntarily, right? It wasn't learn to code because this is good for your job because you can do whatever. Like, this is how I'm expressing and connecting. Granted, that was the bar that you had to cross to get there, which is not great. But those people aren't all dead. They still live amongst us. You know what I mean? Like, they lurk. They might be some in this room. Like, and so I think that's the thing to really, really remember, is that it is a recent, pervasive cultural behavior to express yourself through all human medium, but the web being one of them. It is not any different than picking up your saxophone or a guitar. It's not different than picking up a paintbrush. And the reason we see it differently is we have platforms that stole our attention and taught us that the way that you connect and share is through the experience that they've designed. Maybe that's great for a lot of people. A lot of people are starting to chafe at the limits of that. There is another thing that has never gone away. And, you know, if this is a thing that resonates, like, to be the advocate of it, the steward of it, we make it normal. So I just think that's sort of something that's there. It's I'm not saying it's easy enough. I'm not saying it's simple. Like there's a lot of improvements to be made, but also, even if it stayed weird and complicated, there's still tens of millions of people that might be interested in it.
There's a lot of weird and complicated people out there.
Yeah. It's not weirder and more complicated than a lot of other hobbies that people do all the time.
I think my very quick question, this is one of those things that are kind of like a loop, right? This has happened before, in a sense, when we, you know, back, I would say around the .com time, everyone just wanted like an open web. And
Yeah.
what do you think went wrong? So what do we learn from that so that we don't make the same mistakes again?
I mean, there's an infinitely long answer. I think one short answer is there's a lot of creative value destruction when new platforms take off, right? It's actually one of the great things about them. So, like, arguably, podcasts stole a lot of energy and attention from terrestrial radio or something like that, right? And that made people want to kind of bring back value capture, right? And the truth was, like, the open web era was very democratized and decentralized, and actually you see it in the vestiges of what survives. So podcasting is, in economic terms, a very inefficiently monetizable platform, right? You can't do surveillance-based advertising across large-scale podcasts by design. That wasn't a design intent of it, but that is the outcome of that kind of platform. So it's one of the reasons that, like, the Spotifys of the world want to capture it and, like, have proprietary podcasts that are only on Spotify. It's like, then we can monetize, we can do all these things. But the inefficiency of, it's really hard to track, you can't just do advertising across it, you don't know who clicked on what, is the nature of that kind of platform, right? And so people saw that happening with content, and that individual humans were creating, said, like, well, we have to create centralized platforms so we can capture it. And I think some of that was, like, positive because they're like, well, that'll make it easier for us to build an easy experience. And we do want to build a business and all this kind of stuff, but also some of it was capture, right? It's like, well, there's all this value.
It also makes it easier for the content creators to get reach, which is the game theoretical problem with it too.
It's what you said about designing systems in a way that people want to do the thing that the system's designing to do.
Yeah. And so to that point, like, that's sort of the next challenge. Can we do discovery and not have it be centralized? And can we do that sort of that piece? But to your question about like why did it happen? It was, economics of both the positive sense of like we want to enable a lot of people, and of the sort of like capture sense of like, well, this is a chance for me to get rich off other people doing they're living their lives.
One thought that I've had for a while now, and I mean, there's so many parallels to this, and at the risk of sounding too much like the metaverse, just know that that's not what I'm talking about, is we have like the same as ever piece, right? Humans want the same thing, is we have homes that, historically would spend, not historically, even today, we spend a lot of time decorating, being a personality, like putting our personality into our space, that this is my expression of like the space that I've created for myself, and we always think about that space as very tangible, as very physical. And as we're shifting towards more and more of our things, our belongings becoming digital and online, I think that even though these things are possible, from the outside or like to the average person, and I might be wrong here, the impression is you either put something out there like content, podcast, or personal website or something like that, and now you're public to the whole world. What about like a photo album that I would have on my coffee table that I curate and perfectly scrapbook and then want to go show some of my friends? It feels like the only opportunities to do that today are those social media platforms that are designed to create closed-knit circles. But how do you create your own closed-knit circle online? You're basically trying to recreate physical assets that you've had, that you cherish and you care about in your home, and trying to create literally create your home in a digital space without it being the metaverse. And having the ability to create your own Lego blocks, right? Like you said, like we're basically renting right now. We're renting a photo album from Instagram, we're renting our camera reel from TikTok, versus how do I own my photo album? How do I own my home? And I think that's a bit of a mindset shift of like creating systems that allow you to think about it as Lego pieces of like, maybe I build a Lego thing at home and now all my friends that come over get to see it. The same way, being able to create something like that using digital Legos of like people being able to come and see what I created and it being my space, without it being my space, but where did that come from? So I think that's one of those things I think about a lot, because I think that's the direction we're headed in, is like more and more of our stuff is becoming digital, and more of our connections are becoming global, meaning your friends aren't going to be able to come visit you in person all the time to see the world that you've created.
But the shared context happens in spaces that are created for a purpose, right? The communities that are healthy online, and they can be whatever, it can be a subreddit, it can be a forum about a particular topic, they're about something, right? If you make a platform that's about everything under the sun, they tend to go pretty poorly. If you make it like it's about this purpose and we know what our task is and we're sort of aligned, or about like this physical community, whatever it is, but something that sort of aligns you. And so then you have a place that you can share, and that could be about you or it could be about that community. And this sort of gets to what Chad was talking about, is like the underpinning to that is identity. Like one of the original sins of the internet is there isn't some universal identity system, right? And so we delegate identity to these platforms because we're like, well, that's how I know who they are. But we have sort of proxies for identity. Email is one of them. Some of the other stuff that happens sort of socially. And this is part of what I think one of the reckonings is like, we've recreated our social networks in different contexts multiple times, but also I don't want to connect to the same people on LinkedIn as I do on Instagram, as I do whatever. So we don't have multiple contextual networks.
Yeah.
Right? And I think, to me, it seems like we're very likely to have one more round of creating another network kind of thing. But how do we make it be the last time that we have to do that? And it's a good enough identity that we can layer these different contexts on. Like, that's not a solved problem. Like, that's a hard problem. But there are a lot of people sort of tilting at that right now. So I feel like we might have a chance. I'm more optimistic about it than I've been in about 15 years.
So that brings us to an interesting question, because to Shan's original point a few minutes ago about how can we prevent this from cycle repeating, and in my head, where I kind of answered that question in my head while you guys were going, was that a lot of it is grounded in capital investments, and people that invest need to get their money back multiple times over, and as long as that's a thing, then there's always going to be this tension between free and open and widely available and democratized versus more kind of closed garden and highly curated and algorithmic driven and all the things that come with that. And so there's a question from the audience that is kind of pointing to that, and it's from James, and it's for Chad, but I think there's opportunity for everybody to contribute. I'm sure you all have opinions. So people over profit was a recurring theme this morning. Given the importance of investment on new technology, how can VC support this perspective?
I'll start since I am one, but I'm pretty bad at it so far. I think the lame answer is there are some VCs, my firm included, and I've got like a little group that I am in contact with, including like Union Square Ventures founders, and this wonderful one, Zoe Weinberg in New York, has a thing called Ex Ante, which is almost exactly about this. We just ask ourselves the questions all the time because we recognize that the model that we're working in is problematic in exactly this way. But we also recognize that, open source makes crappy applications, like I said. So, there needs to be a thing where you create like slick, beautiful applications, but you do it in a way that is good for humanity. And believe it or not, the only reason I've done anything with crypto stuff is because I heard some ideas in like 2016 that were all about this. So like it was all about gearing toward democratization and people owning their data and censorship resistance, not in a crazy anarchistic way, but like pro-democracy sort of way. And there are people that I believe are like really working in that way because there's possible ways to like fund public goods that could be VC compatible but still create something fully open. Impact certificates, hyper certificates, there's all these different ideas around this that are still being worked on, and if things go the way they normally do in Web3, they're probably going to turn out to be great, right? Which means half-baked and launched too early for various reasons that we've already discussed. But I'm still sort of optimistic about this. I'm not a raging idealist about it, but I'm also optimistic about the idea of like people being able to basically like buy into an IPO of a public good, which is then like codified to be open. I think it doesn't have to be crypto, but being able to turn models around like this, I think is really a fascinating experiment that we need to do a lot more work and thought on in the future. Otherwise, I don't have a good answer, so I'd love to hear other perspectives.
I think one of my strongest opinions on this is that there really just needs to be space for a diversity of models. And so going the VC route, building a product that's VC funded is an absolutely normal and, feasible way to do it. But I think we need to start also looking at other models because I think there are models that are more compatible with different types of products, and so some people are looking at different types of funding models. And I don't think, I think as with most things, there's not going to be like, finally, we found the solution to funding technology, and it is not VC, it is this, or finally, we found the solution to social media, it's going to be this platform. It's never that. There's a diversity of options out there. Some of them are better for different types of products, and sometimes it's going to be VC, sometimes it's, a cooperative, or, a crypto-funded model even, or something like that. Sometimes you just have to find it's like we were talking about earlier, it's find the tool that suits the problem.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just want to hit a couple things. Like first my bona fides, I have great friends who are VCs, and I've raised like $100 million in VC over the years. I would just start with, VC is a bad model for most of this kind of work. And part of it is the nature of like, it's kind of, because it's such a visible and prominent part of the media sphere around tech, it sort of shapes the conversation to a disproportionate degree. Like VC is one class of capital, right? And when I started in the industry, it was like 5% of the way that capital is deployed, and it's probably close to 50% now, right? Like it's a radical shift. And granted, like I'm not that old, but like back in the day, people used to get bank loans to do a business, right? It's like I hope they'll loan me some money and I'll be able to build a flower shop or whatever. And the return on that was like 3% over a decade, right? And so the shape of, like, I have been the person who merely returned a little bit more money to the VCs than they gave me. And, you know, it depends on the firm and the context and the relationships. But a lot of times it's a good way to have people be really angry at you, right? And so you're like, oh, okay, but like, you didn't like the product? They're like, I don't give a shit about the product. Like, you had a job to do for me, you didn't do it. And that was clarifying, right? So that part of, like, if you're like, I really want to build these open platforms and I want people to connect, is incompatible with the vast majority of firms. The other thing that's happened in sort of the VC dynamic is, like, there are a lot of very thoughtful people, like the folks Chad mentioned and whatever, like, I've worked with a lot of them. But the loudest, most prominent voices, which you've all heard, have gotten more and more extreme very quickly over the last several years. And again, I'll go back to the Andreessen example because I talked about that earlier today. Well, Union Square Ventures, like a decade or two ago, would be like, you're a founder, you have an idea, you want to build a technology, we want to give you the funds so you can do it. I think they still pretty much are in that space. You know, Andreessen has in the U.S. a portfolio they call American Dynamism, which is a political platform. And they say, if you want to conform to this political platform, then we might cut you a check. It's the complete inverse of that model. And I, you know, as you can probably guess, don't really agree with the platform. But more striking is, that's like a political action committee. That's not a venture capital.
They've got one of those too.
I'm sorry?
They've got one of those too.
Yes, and they got one of those too. Right. So in that case, again, like, the purpose of the system is what it does. There's no way the output they're hoping for is an open protocol. You know what I mean? There's that, like, that's orthogonal to the goal. They said what the goal is. And so I think that's part of the things to reckon with is, like, all VC ain't VC, right? Like the capital, the class of capital it is almost completely severed from what is the purpose for which they're giving you this money. And people who are newer to the industry or haven't raised money, I don't envy you trying to learn, like, what is the incentive or the agenda of the people cutting you a check? How would you know? Because if you go to look it up, you're like, am I going to go to Hacker News, which is a media outlet run by a venture capital firm? Right? Am I going to go to TechCrunch, which is a media outlet founded by a venture capitalist? Right? Like, I don't think they're going to tell you. And so I think that's the parts that are really, we have to have community. We have to have these conversations. We have to have the folk knowledge. And I'm not, you know, I obviously deliberately try to be a little bit provocative, but, like, I'm not that radical. Like, a lot of people who've raised funds over the years will tell you, even very successful entrepreneurs will tell you, this is kind of the conversation to have, but most people don't have access to it. And so I think that's why it's a much harder answer of, like, I don't doubt the cohort you're in is very sincere about wanting to fund a substrate of these things. But I also think most of the founders that, even if they get a little bit of traction, are going to bring to the table one of the bad actors because they don't know and they want to name VC, right? Not that you're not, but you know what I mean. And then, you know, and they end up with somebody whose motivations are completely different because they're like, well, it's still money, right?
And also, I think a lot of the name VCs and the people that you're talking about, like, know how to talk the talk about open platforms and protocols and all these types of things because it's trendy and it, you know, it gets people excited about the next big thing. But, you know, like you said, you have to look at the purpose of the system is what it does. And do they ever produce those?
Yeah, a good example is Chris Dixon, right? I have been on boards with him of multi-billion-dollar companies, sat in the room with him on boards, right? So, like, I'm not that wild that I couldn't be in the room. And I've heard him talk out of both sides of his mouth about what these technologies can do, right? He has made assertions that are factually incorrect about the power of the blockchain or whatever. And then there's other things where I'm like, maybe he means it, though. We want to enable collective bargaining for artists to be able to bargain for the rights of their work. And I'm like, well, how many companies in Andreessen's portfolio have allowed collective bargaining for their workers? 0. So I don't believe you want to enable this for the tech, right? And, like, that's, like, just the sort of falsifiable assertions. That's the questions you got to ask. So I think that's where I go to is, like, there are a lot of people who invest with the bona fides where you're like, if that VC has their own personal website at their own domain and it's got an RSS feed and they're telling you to read it, you might want to believe them.
Chris Dixon does have an RSS feed.
Yeah.
I don't think he knows it, though.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a legacy thing. It also started in the era when it was the only option.
Yeah.
Right? But, like, Fred Wilson just moved his blog entirely to a blockchain-based platform. And I was sort of struck because I was like, I'm sure I could figure it out, but I don't know how to read this by default. Like, it's not the web. it's another thing. And I was like, that's an interesting choice.
Well, I feel like we could continue talking for the next 2 or 3 hours. This was very easygoing, and I really appreciate your candidness and your openness and willingness to share your thoughts and opinions with everybody. I think we'll leave it there for the time being. Thanks so much for your participation. Thanks for your questions. There's other sessions going on for the next hour, I think, and then we'll be back for lightning talks here at 4. Okay, 30 minutes. Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Cheers.